In this video, I'll be comparing two different island ecosystems, Hawaii and American Samoa. American Samoa is located south of the equator, while Hawaii is in the northern hemisphere, and American Samoa is closer to the equator too, while Hawaii is a little bit further. Thus, Hawaii's climate is a little bit cooler in compared to the climate of American Samoa, but both climates are tropical. Another difference is that Hawaii has more different climates, and that is because Hawaii's mountains have higher elevations, and also Hawaii has a dry side and the wet side. The northeast sides of the islands are very lush and green with a lot of rainfall, while the southwest sides of the islands are relatively dry and barren with a lot less rain. In American Samoa, it's green throughout the entire island, with some variations in rainfall, but overall the climate is pretty much the same. Before moving to American Samoa, I lived in the state of Hawaii for 7 years, 2 years in the island of Kauai, and 5 years in the Big Island of Hawaii. While I lived in Hawaii, I worked with and volunteered with various conservation groups such as the Big Island Invasive Species Committee, and learned a lot about invasive species and how a lot of the Hawaiian Islands are dominated by invasive species. Before I even knew which species in Hawaii were native and which ones are not, seeing the landscape, I realized something didn't seem right because previously I've been to a healthy rainforest in Costa Rica and Panama, so I knew something wasn't right. But as I started learning which species are native and which ones are invasive, I started to realize why it didn't look right, and realizing that in the most of the lower elevations of the Hawaiian Islands are all dominated by both invasive plants and animals. In the low elevations of the main Hawaiian Islands, you notice that majority of the trees and other plants you see are all introduced or invasives, and same with the wildlife. Majority of all the birds you see and the lizards are all introduced or invasives, with an exception of some areas where you do have a small percentage of some resilient native species surviving, but generally they're mostly dominated by invasives. At first glance, one might think that the ecosystem is healthy because you see green landscape on the island, but green doesn't necessarily mean good. And once you take a closer look at some areas, you'll notice a lot of some erosion in some areas, while in other areas you'll just see one species of plant or tree dominating the whole areas. Like in some areas, you'll just see ironwood trees dominating the whole area, and the ground just being bare with nothing. And further up in the mountains in the wet areas, you'll see strawberry guava, which is an invasive tree dominating the whole area with nothing else growing in the area. However, in further and higher elevations in the mountains of the Hawaiian Islands, or in fenced areas that have been restored, you will see native forests and some of the surviving native species, such as native forest birds. Now, the native forest birds, they are threatened and endangered by avian malaria, which is from mosquitoes which were accidentally introduced by humans to the Hawaiian Islands. And these native birds have no immunity to avian malaria, which is why the birds are now, some of them are at the brink of extinction due to their vulnerability to avian malaria. I remember a time when my mom and I hiked the Alakai Swamp Trail on the island of Kauai, and one of the things that my mom notices was how eerie and quiet the trail was, and that is because of the forest birds, which are at the brink of extinction. And before, you used to hear the birds a lot, but now, due to avian malaria encroaching further up in the mountains, you now hardly hear the native birds anymore because they're much more rare than they used to be. When I moved to American Samoa, I was very impressed to find out how there were so many native trees and other native plants in such low elevations, even in inhabited areas. There's also so much more native wildlife there that you see almost every day, even in the most inhabited areas, such as many native skinks, native pigeons, and a lot of fruit bats, which you see flying every evening. However, American Samoa does have some invasive species such as the albizia tree, African tulip trees, and the myna birds, but in comparison to Hawaii, there's a lot less invasive species, and the native species still dominate most of the areas. That said, American Samoa has a relatively healthy ecosystem, despite still having some invasive species and other ecological threats. But when traveling to other nearby island nations, such as Western Samoa and Fiji, there I noticed that there were a lot more invasive species dominating. Like, I noticed the most common ones were albizia and African tulip trees that you see dominating in mostly low elevation inhabited areas. However, in comparison to Hawaii, the native ecosystem is still more resilient, and you'll still see more native wildlife than in Hawaii. I also noticed this at a coastal walk on Apolu Island, where they restored a lot of native vegetation. And you could see that even though there before they had a lot of invasives, once they restored the area, the native trees and other plants were able to regenerate again, where areas in Hawaii and lower elevations that were dominated by invasive species, it is very difficult to plant native plants there again. And even if you do successfully grow native trees to maturity, they still have a hard time regenerating on their own. Now, the reasons why the invasive species in Hawaii are dominating more than Samoa or Fiji, there are various reasons. One is Hawaii experienced a lot more disturbance, especially compared to American Samoa, because in Hawaii, they had the sugarcane plantations, which cut down a lot of native forests and cleared a lot of land. And then there was also the large cattle ranching too. And also, Hawaii has experienced more introductions of species because is a travel hub, and also many people from all over the world have brought various plants and animals. So compared to Samoa, there's just a lot more introductions of plants and animals. For example, in Hawaii, they have a lot more introduced ungulates, such as feral goats, feral pigs, feral cows in some areas, and even feral sheep as well. And some Hawaiian islands even have introduced deer too, which are also very destructive to native vegetation. While in American Samoa, they do have feral pigs, but the density of feral pigs is much lower in American Samoa than in Hawaii, and this is most likely due to more pressure by hunting by people. In Hawaii, people hunt the animals a lot too, but their numbers are just much larger. And the geographic location also plays a crucial role because the Hawaiian Islands are one of the most remote islands of being separated from any continental landmass, while the Samoan Islands and the Fijian Islands are closer to the Australian continent, which means they have more species that are, while native to the islands, but also native to other places around the world. And because they're not as far from the continents, sometimes species still naturally drift there. And so the ecosystem is more resilient, where areas Hawaii is so remote from any continental landmass that majority of the species are endemic, which means they're found nowhere else in the world. And they're just a lot more susceptible to invasion and to introduce diseases and competition from other species due to lack of defenses that they've evolved being on such isolated islands. For example, Hawaii has some invasive species that are native in American Samoa. For example, the mangroves, were never native to Hawaii and were introduced by humans and are causing ecological harm. Whereas in American Samoa, the mangroves play a crucial role to the ecosystem. And another example is the mule's foot fern, which is native to American Samoa but is considered invasive on the Hawaiian Islands. This video was made based on personal experience and observation. Thanks for watching.